net zero requires a huge structural shift, doesn't it? A massive change across every part of the economy. And that's going to require people to change behaviour. And I think what's interesting is that the progress that we have made so far as businesses, as an economy, to decarbonise has largely been achieved without the public or businesses really being involved and having to change things fundamentally. If you think about decarbonising the electricity grid or the efficiency of, white goods or vehicles, all of that has largely occurred behind the scenes. Whereas as we go forward, and particularly to meet the pathway to net zero by 2050, and we've seen the Prime Minister announce 78% reductions by 2035, that's going to involve much more intervention in people's lives. And I think behaviour change to encourage them to adopt new technologies and new ways of working, that's going to be fundamental to this shift. Our purpose of making things that matter work better for everyone is very much predicated on tackling today's societal and environmental challenges, and in tackling those, behaviour change is absolutely going to be fundamental to that. And I think businesses that ignore this really run the risk of getting left behind. Investors, their staff, their clients are going to be looking at those organisations that can help them on their transition to net zero, and are going to be avoiding organisations that aren't embracing this journey. And, I often see it being seen as, well, is that a constraint to business strategy, to profit? And of course, it's not. It's absolutely the reverse of that. A business that adopts net zero is going to be driving towards the markets of the future, driving efficiency in its business operation, and bringing its employees and customers along with it. But I think this is very much a leadership issue fundamentally, and we need to see the whole net zero journey embedded in a company's purpose, in its strategy, in its commercial model, and ultimately owned by the board and the senior leadership team, which then provides the platform for staff to really get engaged and be given the mandate and the freedom to make it happen in practice. One of the things that we're doing at Gemserv is applying for B Corp certification, which is for us a way of showcasing to our staff what good looks like, what we're doing already, what's the best practice that is out there, the standard, if you like, the gold standard for really embracing not just net zero, the whole ESG agenda actually. And we want to use that as a way of holding our feet to the fire. And what is interesting is that the B Corp certification requires a change to the company articles. So go right to the board, to the shareholders, and say, we're going to change our articles to really embed this in the constitution of this business. And I think a lot of things then in terms of how staff then can take forward this agenda really stems from that, senior management buy-in to this initiative. It shouldn't be looked at as a cost. This is a provision of expenditure that we need to make. It needs to be looked at as an investment, because those organisations that aren't encouraging their staff and engaging their staff, aren't adjusting their business model, aren't aligning their strategy with net zero, they're simply going to get left behind as clients move to more progressive organisations, as markets move on, as investors look elsewhere. Companies are going to get left behind. So of course it needs financial provision, but I think it should be viewed that this is an investment on the company's future, not just something, we have to do it because it's the right thing to do. Of course it's the right thing to do, but it's the right thing to do both for environment, society, but it's also the right thing to do for the business itself, because without it, the business will get left behind. I mean, we're a B2B business, and therefore, our customers are other businesses, organisations, but ultimately they have customers as well, and we're mindful of the end customer and everything that we're doing to help organisations on their net zero journey. And of course, the first thing we would always say is about bringing the view of the customer into the early stages of any plan of action and getting their engagement and their understanding, because what is clear that unless a particular service or policy intervention tackles all of the sort of barriers that a customer can feel towards a positive action, whether it's about installing home energy efficiency, for example, unless the response is tackling all of those barriers, the response won't work. And some of these barriers are quite unique to particular customer groups. It can be simply that the hassle factor of doing something is just too much to make it worthwhile, even if you're giving them free home installation as an example. They can't be bothered to clear out the loft. There are a number of barriers, and I think this is where a comprehensive response is needed to overcome those, whether it's through financial incentives, through some regulatory requirements perhaps, as well as the sort of use of technology and trying to get rid of the hassle factor that they might feel. But I think there's also one other fundamental important point here, which is around this whole transition can often be seen as a sacrifice, as a hair shirt agenda. I've got to give up something as an individual, and as I think we know that yes, that will certainly motivate some people in society to do the right thing, but I fear the vast majority of people won't respond to a sacrifice agenda. I've got to give up flying, I've got to give up meat, I've got to give up my car. Whereas, of course, actually, yes, there are massive system changes to be made, but this agenda has got so many positive attributes to it. Moving from a fossil fuel powered car to an electric vehicle, actually, that should be pretty smooth. The benefits of doing so, from not having a noisy, potentially smelly car, with having to use a petrol station, which is one of the worst consumer experiences I think that's out there. All of these things are better than today. A properly insulated home has got to be better than one that isn't properly insulated. How do we showcase the real benefits of this transition?
It's a really interesting time for policy around net zero. It doesn't need to be repeated, but with COP26 happening this year in the UK, there seems to be a huge amount. And I think there's a real shift underway at the highest level of government. And when we look at the aspiration and the ambition around our climate change targets and our climate change objectives, we've seen just this week with the announcement to accelerate decarbonisation across the UK economy, that the UK sees its sort of almost a post-Brexit role on the international stage as being a leader on climate, and actually that can not only help create a role for us and a profile for us, but be an economic opportunity. I think that's going really well. Then I think we've seen lots of great support for innovation and for individual technology areas. We've seen huge cost downs in some of the key technologies that will be important for us longer term. So yeah, there's lots of great work going on there. I guess where I would sort of, or certainly where I feel there could be more, is around fiscal policy. And no doubt we'll get onto this again in this subject. But for me, there's more that could be done around taxation. There's more that could, we didn't even look at fuel. It appears we didn't even look at fuel duty at the most recent budget. Just we'll freeze it, and that just increasing taxes may not be it's certainly not the only tool in the box or the right thing to do every time. But it does feel to me that fiscal policy is still quite short term when it comes to achieving net zero. Yet what we need is a sustained effort over a number of years, and that's going to require some quite big changes. So that would be the area I think needs most work. I think carbon tax is a really interesting topic, and that there's been lots of organisations that have started to call for this, and actually we can look abroad, both close to home and more internationally, for examples of carbon taxes being put into place. For me, I think it's a huge. I think ultimately it's probably where we need to get to, but it's also a huge step for us as a country, and one that can, for me, can only really be taken once we have societal buy-in, as wide as we can to the challenge. And because I don't think it's possible to implement an economy-wide carbon tax without creating some unintended effects. We can do our best to alleviate matters, and Phil mentioned earlier in this interview that the costs of energy bills to consumers, the affordability of those to individuals who might be struggling to pay their energy bills, that's a really important potential unintended effect which we would need to address. And then you can pick out other examples in transport and so on. So it's a really difficult challenge, and for me, I hope the Treasury's net zero review, they've been working on net zero review over the past 6 months, I hope that really starts to look at individual areas of the economy, individual parts of our sort of tax base, and look at reform to those so that we can make those fairer and more reflective of the carbon consequences, as it were, of doing things. I think that's the first step towards a carbon tax. But ultimately, people are familiar with taxes. They know that they only tend to go up over time one way. They do create certainty and clear signals for investment. So, I think an economy-wide carbon tax should, it's probably where we should be aiming to get to. And I think one of the mistakes that we often make is to look at companies as having a single personality or a single sort of overriding motive. My experience throughout my career has been that actually companies are collections of interests, of stakeholder interests. So it could be shareholders, could be customers, could be employees. And actually, if you want to create change in companies, you just have to persuade enough of those stakeholders that it's in their interest long term to change, and those factors will drive that change. And for me, regulation is a really important part of that space. If you're too aggressive with it, you can create opposition and turn people off with it. If it's too far off, you can create false comfort. So you need to create the signal and calibrate it so that it encourages the action. So whether it's an end date for the sale of fossil fuel vehicles, or an end date for the sale of fossil fuel heating systems, or something else, it's regulation for me is really key for driving investor behaviour. You just got to try and get the calibration right.
The technologies that I'm really excited about are in the sort of hydrogen space. So we work, sort of manage the Hydrogen Task Force, which is a group of organisations that are leading on hydrogen in the UK and are developing some really interesting technologies that can make a massive difference to our ability to meet net zero. So I know there's a lot of people who are out there who will claim that hydrogen is the solution to everything. That's definitely not the case. It is in no way a silver bullet. It can't solve all of our problems, but it just so happens to have characteristics and properties which make it the perfect complement to electrification. There's things that are hard and expensive to electrify, like industry, heavy duty transport, and hydrogen is just perfect for those applications. And some of the drawbacks that you get with sort of big increased electrification, such as pressure on infrastructure, sort of lack of intraseasonal storage options, are mitigated by having this mixed approach and using hydrogen. So the use of hydrogen alongside electrification gives us a more resilient, flexible energy system that will enable us to sort of meet net zero. I think we actually have a reasonably good system in the UK for supporting innovation. I think the burden of the cost of innovation has to fall somewhere between industry and government. Government has to be prepared to share the risk with industry, or risk the UK being left behind. And I think for me, the key here is that this has to be done as early as possible. We have examples in the UK where We've done some excellent early stage work, and then we've kind of failed in that area of commercialization. A classic example of this is around sort of, battery technologies, where the UK is now committed, lots of, I think it's 240 million or something like that to research next generation battery technologies through the sort of Faraday Battery Challenge. But arguably, these investments would have had a much greater impact if they'd been made earlier, before the South Koreans, Japanese and Chinese sort of solidified their significant leadership position in battery technologies. The UK has, world-class R&D facilities all over the country. We have some of the best universities in the world. We're really great at, developing, pioneering technologies. As I said, what we've traditionally been not so good at is actually commercializing some of that. And I think that better collaboration between universities and businesses would help that. I actually think this is something that has been recognized, and we are getting better at it, and we are seeing more of that. But yeah, absolutely, it's a really important part. I think the other thing that is often missed is the speed that we now need to move at. That's that sort of implication again of net zero. CCC estimates in order to hit our 2050 net zero target, we now need to hit a 78% reduction by 2035. We effectively lost 15 years in a day. 27th of June 2019, we had 30 years to hit 80%. 28th of June 2019, we had 15 years. It means we just can't wait. We can't afford to wait around and see which solutions look most promising. We actually need to move extremely quickly from strategy, technology development to deployment. And I think, the reality is that the timeframes for, technology maturity mean that actually there's probably not a lot of technologies that are going to have a big impact on net zero that we don't already know about. So I think the other thing that I think is really important that often gets missed is this idea around coordination and that whole big picture piece. I think it's really important that the UK doesn't start to develop technologies and policies in silos. Net zero, whilst it sort of primarily sits with the sort of BEIS policy team, it's also, policy teams across DFT, BEIS, MHCLG, DEFRA, all making decisions which impact each other. Similarly, we've got devolved governments and authorities all setting different targets, all developing different policies. And sometimes these things sort of don't come together. So I would like to see a sort of greater coordination between the various different parts that are developing solutions and developing regulation and policies, so that these things can work together and we don't end up with sort of, confusion in the market.